Welcome to the Lost Signals Discusses Literature,
where we apply the revolutionary Mott skill
to classic and contemporary works of prose.
So, join us once again, won't you?
Hello, and welcome back to the Lost Signals Discusses Literature. Today we're going to be talking about a short story called You Disappearing, written by Alexandra Kleeman. And I am your host, Steve Ramosi, joined by Jonathan Ian Mezer.
If you don't watch yourself, I'll disappear you.
Scott Thurlow.
Bye-bye, Birdie.
And Chris Morgan.
Transparency is all mine.
And I'm going to throw to Scott real quick for the funny log line.
Yeah, so, and like that, everything was gone.
He's not wrong. Ian, would you like to discuss the plot with us?
Well, the apocalypse is happening.
An apocalypse.
Things are starting to disappear. It could be your pants. It could be you.
Your soul, even.
It could be our audience. They don't actually exist.
Already happened.
And generally it follows a woman who is waiting out her turn to disappear as everything around her just slowly starts to not even fade.
Go away.
Just one day it's gone.
Yeah. And the world ends not with a bang, but with a just pop,
with a
and
pop,
it's gone.
with a poof.
Yeah, I mean,
the plot.
that's a pretty good rundown of the plot. I think it's a really interesting story. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if it's enough to give it full credit for, like a 3, but I'm on a strong 2 at this point, I think.
It's a very effective story in that you really feel the despair of what it would be like to go through this.
Yeah.
And when memories disappear, you don't know what is gone. It's almost like if chronicling someone going through dementia. But
the entire world is
You son of a bitch.
once.
I was actually
too.
gonna get to that in themes, but
but I think that's heavily pervasive throughout this entire story, and it's a very mournful story. Again, on the narrative, I don't know if it needed a stronger plot. It's just kind of what it actually I feel would feel like to go through a situation like this.
Yeah.
But I'm on you. I agree with you on a strong 2 for this, but it's definitely a strong 2.
Yeah.
I would somewhat largely agree, if that makes sense. More largely agree. Yeah, I'm looking at a pretty solid 2. And as you mentioned, it's more of like we've done a couple of stories like this where it's almost more of a mood piece than an actual like plot per se, which is fine. Like the apocalypse, the disappearing thing is almost like a framework really for like to explore this character's feelings and like as related to this apocalypse as it's deemed even in the story. So yeah, I think it's got a very certainly melancholic feel to it for sure. And maybe like there's some rays of hope, but because of the nature of it, the setup is like that everything, including the character, is going to disappear almost certainly by the end of the story.
One of the strong narrative points of this is the main character's relationship with her lover, who she fled
her
New
estranged
York.
lover.
She fled New York when this started to happen to go to Chicago and be with her brother. He disappears at some point, and they are contacting on the phone throughout most of the work until they're no longer contacting. She doesn't know if he's gone or whether he just decided to flee himself, and you start challenging the memories of
the phone is gone for sure, right?
Yeah.
Like it might not even be that he, or I suppose she. I don't remember if it ever says if it's a man or woman that is her, significant.
Technically, it doesn't. Neither
previous significant other, but
we just assume
you
that.
never know whether that person is gone. You just know that the phone doesn't exist anymore.
Well, the uncertainty of this world, especially as more and more starts to disappear, again, very pervasive throughout the work. And I think that's one of the highlights of it.
Yeah, I would say it has a very good style, which we'll get to later, but just for scoring plot, it's fine for what it needs to be. You're right, like maybe it would have been helpful if it was a longer piece, so there was more time to fill out the world and therefore have more of a plot. But that's not necessarily the point of the story either.
Right.
So I can't like really detract it for that. So I think I'm gonna look at a solid 2. And what do you think, Chris?
I was going to say solid 2, and I think it's the right length because if you go any further, you're going to get lost in the details. And I think she gave you just enough deep detail to make the point that she was getting at. I think I immediately I read the last paragraph a couple of times because I initially, and maybe this would be a segue into themes or whatever, but it seemed to me like an analogy for like Alzheimer's.
Mhm.
Like Ian said, it's heavily reminiscent of that because of the nature of
Well, that's what I was saying because when Ian said dementia, I was agreeing with him.
Yours, kind of like that.
Yeah. So I didn't really think it needed to be any longer than it was. I thought it had just enough detail to make its point. I agree with you. It's going to be a strong 2 for me. That would probably be about.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I mean, that sounds good. 2s for plot.
I got no issues
all
with
around.
all giving it 2s.
Right. Exactly. So, Scott, why don't you take us on to themes?
So this one's kind of an interesting one. Like, I guess I'll say this before I say it. I don't know where else to say it, but this is something like I would have kind of written myself. Like, very much in the same vein. I kind of like this sort of dreamlike and haunting and sort of inwardly looking reflection, almost like
Without answers.
Yeah, while framed by some kind of like vague, world-ending thing.
Yeah.
In a sense. And this one, like, of course, she says like it's more slow. It's almost there's a line in that's really good. I'll get into style, but it was like again I can't. The apocalypse was quiet. I got it. The apocalypse was quiet and had a way about it, a certain charm. It could be called graceful, right? It was taking a long time. So like it's not like nukes or whatever, like monsters. It just things start disappearing, and at first people think it's not like funny. Like there's internet videos until the internet wasn't a thing anymore,
Yeah.
right? Which is a good line. So it's more of like a reflection of how to deal. Like sort of got relationship like aspects to it. Like Ian said, the character left one city to go to another, and therefore leave their relationship behind. So then, but they still keep in contact via the phone, just to have some kind of human connection there. Like whatever might be left, whatever scraps of the relationship might still be there, and affection for each other. So like, I'm not sure if there's anything specific other than again just sort of a reflective mood piece, and to get you in this mindset. It's actually this reminded me a little bit of something we did a while back, which was the Janitor in Space.
Mm-hmm.
Check that episode out. But yeah, like it's just a similar feeling thing to that to me. So I don't think it's bereft of themes, but I don't think it's super strong. But I think because it focuses on that essentially, like on this character's feelings in the situation and looking back at their past, and when like looking toward the moment when they might lose the memory or themselves, right? So like it was all very nicely ingrained in there, but that's all I have. So I'm probably looking at like a softish 1, but still probably a 1 for themes, but I'm not like super attached to it. So
there is a very interesting theme, and the irony of our apocalyptic culture in that we're all can't wait for the zombie apocalypse or some kind of
there was a
grand
line like that,
like the nukes coming off, which one of you said that. This is it's not exciting. It's something slow and painless, and just a disappearance that happens, and you're just waiting your turn. And no matter how you prepped for it, it didn't matter. It's going to slowly come for you, and it's the. What's interesting to me is the lack of violence that's happening in the world. It's more of that almost. It feels everyone kind of
people like resign, sort of.
Resign is the perfect word for it, to this fate. Now they say that there are people offering hope, such as like someone who I can speak to the disappeared, but it just that clinging to hope, but no one is. It's not a world which you can come up as the alpha male. This is the world where everything is slowly
everything's on an even playing field. Going away one by one. Yeah.
And you have no control over anything. I mean, like, because she was talking about, everybody try to prepare, like, we always planned.
Yeah, as you said, right. There was a line in there that was like.
Yeah, and it's just like everything's beyond your control. And this reminded me, it just hit me. Don't remember which one of you guys said it. There's a Japanese movie from 2000 called Pulse. And we'll motz it sometime. Because
maybe.
this fuck you, we're gonna motz it.
Watch out for that motz.
Listen, you're all witnesses. No, but this reminds me an awful lot of that.
Yeah.
and I really don't want to go into it any more than that, but it just
Please don't.
Just thematically, go fuck yourself. Just thematically, because there was it's really interesting about the fact that one of the themes can also be isolation. And that we rely so much on
That's fair.
technology. We rely so much on the internet. It's just like, well, they had internet until they didn't. They had the videos. And she at one point was saying, like, I've got the last phone, on Earth. And then it's all these things. There's a level of getting lost in that. There's so many different ways we can communicate with each other, and the world's disappearing, and those things are disappearing. And
Actually, I like that. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean that is very much the idea of this. There's a certain point at the end of this story where it gets into talking about people's belief about the afterlife and how people believe about the afterlife, and like whether or not we're all going to meet up again on the other side of
We'll meet again someday,
or whatever. And I love that too, in terms of what this story is trying to say is like, humans try to cling to this idea that when they disappear, they go somewhere, right? And you don't really know if they do, but it goes into that type of thing as well. I'm actually going to give this a pretty strong one for themes. I
agree.
I really like the themes a lot, and I think that for such a short story, it talks a lot about what your expectations are for life, and when those start to go away, what happens to you, what happens to your mindset, and also, the whole thing about the afterlife is like, this is certainly something that would get people to start thinking about what they think of as life after death in a different way, right? Like what death means, because blinking out of existence is a very different thing than having, somebody die and you can bury their body and try to get over it. It's just like they're gone now.
Yeah, but what's it like when you die?
Right. And it discusses that too.
Well, here's an interesting one for you specifically, Scott. This reminds me a lot of Everybody's Gone to the Rapture.
Also, that's perfect. I was going to have my notes. It reminds me also of The Leftovers quite a bit, if anyone's familiar with that. Yeah, very similar kind of idea because of the nature of said apocalypse, for sure.
It's a slow rapture.
Yeah, exactly. And then it was taking a long time. So yeah, like that's true. And like everything you guys just said does kind of convince me for a stronger one. I mean, like I said, my gut instinct was to give it a decent one. But you're right, like a lot of that stuff is sort of intertwined, and because it's more of a thought piece, as we said, then you, in theory, can see that those angles in it and maybe think about them yourself. So solidly done, and I will give it a little bit of a stronger one than I was going to originally.
Sounds good. All right, so we're gonna go ones all around for themes.
I think so.
And Chris, you have antagonist. Is there one? Rapture?
Rapture? No, I don't believe in that. No, I was gonna say fear of the unknown. Basically, how do you deal with the unknown? Because in this, they talked about how some people were. She even said at one point, like, people kind of resolved themselves to the situation. People panicked. She just, people were going. Her
I was gonna say her lover like still going to work and shit.
People were disappearing, and he's like, I still have this thing to do. So there's a sense of denial about it. He or she is an architect, and working on plans for a building that's never going to get built for for clients that may not be there.
For a world that will eventually be gone altogether.
Yeah, but there is also that sense of denial. I mean, you got that stage of grief where denial is one of them. And she and her lover were talking about, like, they kind of turned it almost into a game as a coping mechanism. Like when things would disappear, they'd go boop or whatever. And when the cat disappeared, she put all the things on the mantle to keep track of when they were disappearing. I mean, so there was different ways everybody in society dealt with it. And the way she was dealing with it was interesting because she was kind of getting to the point where she was where she herself was resolved to it. Like, my brother's not here, but I still make the bed, and I make it like
Sure, it's
they do
always
in
like
the
small coping mechanisms here and there.
yeah, and she's like, "Oh, I tried to call you, and it said your number was no longer there." And then the last thing is where she's kind of mixing all the different metaphors that she had a dream that there's this woman in Nebraska who she could talk to the dead.
No, it wasn't a dream. Like this woman claimed.
No, but at the end, she's talking about it like she's kind of.
I didn't think that it was a dream. Is all I'm saying. Like that. Apparently, this person in the world, there was a woman in Nebraska who claimed that she could speak to the disappeared, but that was like a real thing that was happening.
Yeah, but she also, because I think she'd mentioned it earlier in the thing, but this time at the end, the last paragraph, she kind of combined it when you're looking for the missing person on the phone.
Yeah, all right. I mean, I didn't really get that angle of it, but
that's what kind of, when you said dementia, that's one of the things where I was just like, one of the things I was going to bring up themes, because you're starting to mix what happened, because while she's sitting there, lights go out, and she's talking about like there's never actual silence. There's always some kind of vibration, whether it's a heat or whatever, and she couldn't feel any of it, and she didn't know when she was going to disappear. And then she said about this thing where you talk to the woman in Nebraska, and you press 1 or something, and you tell her if it was a male or female. Basically, it was the same thing she was doing. What opened up the story when she was on the phone.
That's an interesting thing. I didn't take that.
Yeah, I didn't get the interpretation, but I suppose you could.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting look at things.
Yeah, I stopped to get gas, and then we hear it, and I like reread the last paragraph.
No, well, I definitely think she becomes more and more of an unreliable narrator as the story progresses, because she herself admits that the memory starts to go.
Yeah.
So
in terms of antagonists, though, like I think you're right. It's this idea of the unknown, like who's next to go, right? It's just the apocalypse. The chosen apocalypse itself is the antagonist in this, and yeah, I don't know what I'm going to get. Like, it's an effective part of the story. It doesn't feel all that antagonizing, I guess. Like,
I think that's the point in a lot of them.
Like, and like that, right? But like, and again, that is the point. It's supposed to be like this quiet, like gentle apocalypse, and is that like, does that mean that I have to give it a 1 for antagonist? Maybe
not. But okay, I might make you a quick point. Like, I Fear the Known, I do like that. Like, that's almost always going to be effective antagonist, regardless of any framework in any story whatsoever. But in the face of it, as you mentioned, I believe, like, everyone's preparing for this or that apocalypse. But because of the one that is introduced, it's like the helplessness in the face of that. So it's both that and the fear of unknown.
It's the futility of fighting the inevitable.
Yeah, that's very well said.
That is such, I find, a much scarier future than...
It might be the scariest thing.
But, like, I always felt in this story as though the character was at peace with it almost, right?
I think she was struggling, or the main character was struggling.
She didn't seem that way.
What's that? You don't think she felt that way?
Not through the whole story, no.
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe eventually.
The whole time she was grasping at things.
I'm agreeing with that.
Ran away and then started grasping.
The correct phrase.
Again, resigned is the best way we can say it.
Yeah, like resigned to it
at
for
the end.
Sure. And I felt like all the way through, it was like, well, I guess I had to call. When my cat disappeared, I guess I had to call this number, and
the Bureau of Disappearances
pressed
hotline.
A certain assortment of numbers, and then I would tell them what it was that disappeared, and that's the way that things worked. Like, it never felt like she was fighting against anything. I'll say.
I don't know, man, but
there's nothing to fight against.
Like,
exactly,
that's the thing.
But like, does that make it antagonistic? That's my question.
I think it mostly, like,
you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
This is a difficult, the way that we've set up our system. This story doesn't jive with it perfectly, and so I'm trying to fit something into that slot.
Yeah, but I have something that, and I think we've all kind of said it, but if you put it in terms of that, it's something that she can't control, that's inevitable, but she's always trying to adapt to. Sure. It is something that is there. It's intangible and tangible at the same time, that the absence it's like the absence is what's tangible. Like the
I do like
intangible
that.
becomes tangible is what I'm saying.
I get you. And like you said, like Chris, that she's sort of on top of that, going back to what you just mentioned earlier, is like she's sort of setting up like various coping mechanisms, even though she realizes it's futile at the end anyway, like no matter what. So I think that's pretty effective. Like, while not she might be like scarily antagonized by it, I still think the nebulous force is enough there for me to give antagonist a 1.
It's how do
I
you
agree.
fight the void?
Yeah.
You
Right.
can't. You have to, and like, even though she sort of, I would say mocks, but kind of criticizes her lover for going about the every day and trying to keep the semblance of their reality. She does the exact same thing.
That they're just two different
And-
mechanisms in the face of
yeah.
this unstoppable thing.
I think just for the fact that this brought about so much good conversation, I have to give it a 1. I really enjoyed
But no,
trying
like,
to figure
I
out
saw what you
the antagonist is. And
No,
like,
no. But in seriously, I get what you mean in the outset. It was a little bit tricky and difficult, at, initially, it
Right.
seems at least. But I think it's effective enough and deserves a 1 here.
All right, I'm down. I'll give it a 1.
For all the things we just said.
One's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's going to bring protagonist to me, and the main character is the clear protagonist of this. And there's no story without her. I mean, it's an easy one for me in this question, I think. It's a good story, and the reason it's a good story is because you get to see kind of the inner workings of the main
Yeah,
protagonist.
so the progression of her, efforts to deal with all this.
Exactly. And it's not
Again, of there.
it's not a story that you I think it's interesting. You only know this person after this apocalypse has happened. It's not like you get to know who they were before,
I mean, you get
really.
small details, but of course framed within,
Yeah.
in light of the apocalypse.
Exactly.
Of course,
It's all in through the reference point of what she has become. And I think it's a really fascinating protagonist. It's the apocalypse through the lens of one person and this very weird, like strange apocalypse, and you get to see how she reacts to everything, and I love that about this story. I think the protagonist is perhaps the strongest part of it, other than maybe style, but
One of the things that fascinates me is the minute you find out that it's just not tangible items that disappear, it's that your memory also goes with it, makes her point of view all the more tragic because you don't know what she's missing at that
It
point.
adds a big facet to it, for sure. That's a good point. I
Yeah.
definitely agree with that. And I was going to give the character a 1 anyways, but I think that is true. Like, it adds such a layer there that you get even more of the psyche, even if the sum of it is disappearing itself.
absolutely.
I agree. This reminded me of the short story upon which that Arrival is based on, and
Story of your life, I believe.
the story of your life. Yeah, and the reason is because the way it was told in such a way that like there was.
I know, I completely agree with you.
I cannot. It's
somewhat,
nebulous. I
somewhat
can't put my. I
disjointed,
can't.
but not quite that.
Yeah, I can't put my fingers on it, but it reminded me so much of that, and I definitely giving it a 1. It's definitely something I recommend. It is something kind of intangible in and of itself, the character. But yeah, I'm gonna give her a 1.
Excellent. All right, 1's all around, and that's going to go to supporting characters. Ian.
Okay, so I'm going to have a very controversial supporting character here, but first I'm going to get the lover out of the way. You don't find out much about them aside from
A few
kind of
bare
the
facts.
conversations between the protagonist and them. Here's my controversial pick: the Seagulls.
Okay.
Are incredibly important in this work because the protagonist sees the seagulls living their lives unaware of the disappearance, and you see one seagull chewing a plastic toy trying to eat it, and
Yeah, I remember
as
that.
a metaphor for humanity's how humanity is dealing with the apocalypse. We're still doing a futile
They're,
gestures,
like, going through the motions.
going through the motions,
It's
even
like,
though humans are aware that this the apocalypse is happening, but they're as what's the word? They can't change it as much. They're as weak as the seagulls are to changing their future, and I think that overall, most like the cat's also there as I
thought you might say that,
but
as a kind of a jokey thing,
but that's more symbolic of how things disappear. I think the seagulls are more metaphorical, and I think they're more important.
I do like that. I do remember that scene. I like that angle. So technically, Cookie the cat, like it starts with the disappearance of the main character's pet,
Mrs. French's cat.
Cookie the cat has disappeared. Is missing.
You should have gone with that as a longer angle. That's awesome. But great ref.
My microphone.
Well done. It's so funny. He blew off his mic here. But no, like I mean, yes, that's a bit more jokey. But I do like your angle. Like I remember the seagull section, if you will, and I think that's a pretty good parallel to sort of humanity's, like feudal struggle, as we mentioned in mindset earlier previously. So yeah, like you might say there's not that many side characters. Like of course the ex-lover, but like I think it all rounds itself out, and I do very much like how you laid it out there, E. So I was actually going to give this a 0 because I was only looking at the ex-lover as the only other character like that appears really like in the story has any relevance. But thinking about it and talking about it, I do think it's more of a broader thing. So I'll give like maybe the world itself a 1 as sort of,
or the absence of it.
Yeah, exactly. As embodied by the seagulls and their plight as well as related to humanity's plight in this framework.
I think the seagulls as a supporting character is perfect because that to me was the single saddest scene in the whole thing. The way she was talking about the waves, the Ferris wheel.
It was very desolate.
She couldn't even go on the Ferris wheel because nothing would work. Parts of it are broken off. She brought 2 apples. One of them was disappeared. She dropped the core on the ground. The seagulls, the lapping of the water off of the lake. It was just. It was one of the things that was in a story where you get enough detail just to tell you what was going on. Like the cat disappeared, her lover on the phone, her brother. That scene when she went to the Ferris wheel and watched the pigeons and had the single most description of anything. From everything else was kind of like a nebulous painting, but in my mind, but that I could see everything with clarity. And I think the seagulls were a perfect summation of what was going on. So I'm giving this
interesting, well argued, and
I do love that scene, and I do love the seagulls as a metaphor. However, I think I'm going to reserve that for style because they are a metaphor and not necessarily a
seagulls are people too. Seagulls are people too.
I was actually going to get a little more controversial because I was going to say I was going to actually call the Ferris wheel at first. I've forgotten about the seagulls or the lake a character. Hey, and there's precedent with me because I called the Enterprise in Star Trek Beyond a character.
Sure. I think I'm going to stick with a 0 for supporting.
I get it.
Those are very strong elements of the style of this, and I do love like what she did with them. But I don't know if I can bring myself to call the seagulls a supporting character. So I'm going to go with a 0. Everybody else is going to give it a 1.
It's understandable, but like I get you. I get both sides, but I think it does work more on that strength for me, like on the argument that was just made.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. That's a great argument for the seagulls being a supporting character.
That's fair.
It's not quite there for me.
You don't have to respect seagulls. Give them 0.
Speciesist.
We're gonna move on.
Okay,
that's one for you, Scott.
Because I feel uncomfortable now. We're to dialogue. Scott, you want to take us to dialogue?
This one, I would tell you guys up front that I'm looking at a 0 because yes, of course, it's the things that like I guess they would be saying in this situation, but it's not all that engaging. It's more like everything that I'm taking away here, I'm going to put back to style. Like maybe, as you just said, you're doing with like the argument, like the metaphor thing, right? But I wasn't, it was like the weakest part of the story for me. I guess it's the best way I can put it. So like while it wasn't atrocious or anything like that, it was just there in service to all the other parts that make up the story that I think were stronger than it itself. Like we're not counting all her inner thoughts or monologues as dialogue. I don't think, even though we've sometimes had that back and forth on it. But when she calls her ex-lover and they have like a brief conversation, or even when she's remembering conversations they had earlier, it's not all that interesting. It's just the little details that sort of need to be there to fill out some of the stuff. But it's just not as engaging to me. It doesn't add as much to me to the general framework. So it's not like, again, terrible or anything, but I think it's a default 0 in my mind. But I will open up to you guys to speak about it.
So I'll say this. This is, for me, I'm the opposite on this one. I think that the dialogue between her and her ex is very salient to like the continuation of humanity, right? In terms of this story.
Like, I get what you're saying,
it's
but
the only connection with humanity that, like, a human connection that you get. And it's really just like sad and melancholy to me.
Yeah, but it's very clipped, this one. It's like just, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but that's sort of my back and forth as to why it's not that strong. It's just sort of lazily being like, how's it going? Okay, how are you?
But like that's the entire.
Right.
There's so much
I get what you're
subtext to those conversations. I think that like I really see, and to me, I think that makes for a strong dialogue. At least in my head, like what's on the page isn't what the dialogue is to me.
Yeah.
I get you.
What's on the page is like is the overtext, and then the subtext is what's really important to me.
I get the argument you're making for sure.
And building on what you're saying is because their dialogue or the remembered of their dialogue, about how they dealt with it, and that's how you get the information that he was up. She's like, I was waiting for you, and he or she was just like, well, I had this project to do. It's utilitarian, but it does serve like Steve-O was saying, it like serves like a greater purpose. It is part of this way it kind of breaks it out from being an entire monologue. It gives you snippets of conversation that do fill in gaps.
Right.
And that's what I said.
It is kind of a relief from the continual internal monologue.
I agree, but I gave points to Seagulls earlier. So I'm going to
him Seagulls.
No,
I get you.
The Seagulls conversation was fantastic. Too bad we weren't privy to it.
I get you.
Overall, I agree. It's what's not said as much as what is said, but for how good the inner monologue is, I'm going to. I don't know if better dialogue would have serviced this work, but I'm going to give it a 0 here.
Yeah, I guess I'll say it this way: that you're right, Steve-O. Like a lot of it could be the subtext of it, and again, not what is literally like on page being conversed between them. But to me, it's the flattest part of it, and like I guess I'll catch you guys this real quickly. If there was no dialogue whatsoever, would it still be as effective? Would it be fine? Because I think it would
have actually been better if there just her inner thoughts of her what's going on.
I tend to
I don't know. I think it would have been a very different story. Not a better or worse, but like it would have been a completely different story.
See, I don't think it would have been all that different.
If you don't have that other person that you're connected to, that means you have no connection to humanity and you're just left alone. That's a whole different thing.
It's kind of
to me.
Like even a lot of the I would say, if I remember correctly, much of it was even the main character's reflections of conversations. So they weren't actually even happening. A few of them were, yes, but not all. So I don't know. Like all I'm saying is that this to me was the weakest part of the story, even though I didn't think it was bad. But I'm leaning towards a 0 on this one. Is all.
That's fine. I'm not gonna try and change your mind.
You made a fine argument though, for sure.
So we're all good. 1-1-0-0.
I think so.
Okay. Chris, hit us with style.
Well, I was thinking about this when we were talking about dialogue, and this story is it's a weird thing because there's so many elements and they're woven together, and it's kind of hard to always separate them. But I like the style a lot. It is one of these things where it is evolving. She does, as Ian pointed out earlier, become an unreliable narrator at one point, and which kind of puts into question certain things. But like I said, it's a weird thing to figure out because, as I said before, you get just enough information, just enough dialogue, you get just enough everything to grasp what's going on. Yet you get to a point like with the Ferris wheel, and that is very vivid in a story which I would consider to be, brushed with pale watercolors. That was the most vivid of all the scenes. I do like the style. But by the same token, I'm like, what is it? Does that make sense?
No, at least not the end part there.
All right. There's nothing. In a way, it's very hard for me to like talk about some of the other stories we talked about, like the way things were described, oh shit. Please help.
Stop saying
Is it the uncertainty that is? I'm going to say this word again. Permeates throughout this entire work that throws you off. That it's as intangible as the world that's being built, and it's an uncomfortable world that you're being introduced to. Actually, I have a great example of it. The part I love, which is like she saw a part of the lake disappear
when water sometimes disappears,
and then it just, because it's the vastness of the lake, it just filled right back up. But eventually, it's all going to be gone. But just that you could witness for one moment, its disappearance, and then it's such a strange spectacle to be to read about. There's something so the thing is, we want the end to be exciting and it to be as banal as just a piece of the lake disappearing, and then again, if anything, the most absurd part of it is, why would anyone choose Chicago over New York City?
All right.
Well,
suck on that,
the hot
Chicago.
dogs, man. Obviously,
and
they've disappeared already.
Of course.
No,
but
why?
I was going to say, so I have in my notes just real quickly in terms of style itself. Like I mentioned earlier, it's maybe more affinity or bias because it's somewhat in the vein of something I would write and or enjoy. So it has a lyrical quality to it for sure. To me, it's very dreamlike, like you said, because it's sort of the melding of intangible and tangible things, as one of you referenced earlier. And again, the imagery of that, when like you said, when the water's disappearing, or when she reaches down and there's only one apple instead of two, like things like that. So I quite like the style. I think it's one of the strongest parts of the story. And yeah, sure, apparently your mileage may vary, but I think it's very well done, and there's got a very nice flow to it that you can follow along with. And as she becomes more, as the main character becomes more disconnected in a sense, so do you feel it as a reader. So I think that works
for sure.
really well.
And I think the waves are important because that's what happens normally. Like one wave comes and replaces another wave, and it somehow brought this to be somewhat of a natural occurrence, even though it was an atypical occurrence. As I said, there's a lot of threads woven through this, and it's kind of hard, becomes nebulous.
I did love that when she said, like, when water disappears, just more water rushes in to replace it, and like that type of description is what this story is all about. The apples, as you guys mentioned, the cat disappearing and calling in and reporting it.
That's kind of an absurd thing also that I like.
And like when the phone disappears, she calls in and reports her ex missing, even though who knows if her ex is actually missing. She just, because she couldn't dial the number anymore, she assumes that it's a missing person.
If she even knows the number anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
Those are great things you don't know. That's so.
Did the cell tower or the satellite disappear that sent the from the phone signal?
I love all the the thought experiments that this kind of set me off on while I was reading it, and for that alone I would give it a 1 for style. But it's just such a moody, atmospheric story as well, and does a great job of telling its story in the tone that it intends.
Indeed,
You know?
it's very
And
evocative, I'll say.
it does a really great job in that. So I'm going to give it a strong
Yeah,
one.
I'm
for
giving
style.
it probably the strongest one for style.
It sounds like all of us are giving it 1 for style.
Yeah, the fact that I can't wrap my brain around it, then yeah, definitely one.
Can't understand it, so
And
it gets a one.
it's going to go on to recommendation for me. I was the one that chose this story out of a list, but like it looked really interesting, and I was like, I was interested in reading it, and I'm glad that I did. Yeah, I would recommend you read this. It's not a long read. It's,
We'll
take you
put up a
15,
link,
20 minutes to read
well.
or whatever, and it's a story that'll make you think. It's a story that'll, I think it'll stick with you for a little bit. It's not like the craziest thing I've ever, experienced or anything like that, but it's a really solid short story that I really enjoyed reading. So I'm going to give it a 1 for recommendation.
It's a wonderful dirge to the end of humanity.
I like that.
And I enjoyed it quite a bit. I actually plan to reread this again sometime soon, and I recommend everyone read this. It was a neat work.
Yeah, no, I largely agree. Like I said, I have an affinity for this kind of like speculative apocalypse fiction, I guess we'll call it. But because of everything we said, and because of, like I said, the strength of the style itself, I would absolutely recommend it. And yeah, like I said, we'll put up a link, and it's short enough, as Steve-O just mentioned. Yeah, I think it's well worth the read, and perhaps 1 or 2, as he was saying.
Absolutely.
I wholeheartedly recommend it. I agree with Ian. It's something I'm probably going to reread.
I think that's like a la our movie thing. If you want to see a movie again, if you want to read a piece again, it's pretty high praise.
And the fact, like I said, I stopped at the gas station. I reread the last paragraph 2 or 3 times while my it is something that it's very evocative in a lot of ways. So,
yep. All right. Do you know where that leaves us?
Completely agree. If no one else has
no, I think it's
anything
damn
else?
self. You disappearing, quite well done.
You disappearing is going to get a 9 from Chris and 8s from the rest of us, which gives us an 8.25 aggregate score.
I think that's fucking deserving of that. Yeah, man.
I also wanted to mention, which is why I'm on my phone, not that I'm ignoring this podcast. Alexandra Kleeman has a book out called You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, which I have read some pretty good reviews about, and I want to check out myself. So if you're interested in reading some more of her
Until
stuff,
it disappears.
check it there. Yeah,
While it's here.
before it disappears.
Exactly.
So thank you for joining us. I have been your host, Steve Ramosi, joined here by Jonathan Iamedzer.
Oh, God, my small intestine disappeared.
No! Scott Thurlow.
And I myself will be disappearing sometime soon as well.
And Christopher Morgan.
look to see me no more.
Good night.
Editing and engineering by Christopher Morgan. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.